At an exclusive charity auction, a wealthy socialite publicly mocks Clint Eastwood, treating him like he doesn't belong. But when Clint makes a bold move, he doesn't just silence the room, he changes the entire event. What he does next will leave you speechless. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy heartwarming stories like this, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we've got another story you won't want to miss. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel was dazzling that evening. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and the polished marble floors reflected the glow of the room's golden lights. It was an elite charity auction, where the city's wealthiest socialites gathered to flaunt their fortunes under the guise of generosity. Among the well-dressed crowd was Clint Eastwood, sitting quietly at the back. Dressed in a simple black suit, his demeanor was calm, almost understated. He wasn't there to make a scene. He was there for the cause. A wildlife preservation foundation he deeply cared about was hosting the event, and Clint wanted to lend his quiet support. Meanwhile, at the front of the room, a group of wealthy attendees laughed and sipped champagne. Among them was Victoria Hensley, a well-known socialite who thrived on attention. Dressed in a sparkling designer gown and dripping in diamonds, she scanned the room with a smug expression, clearly enjoying her role as the evening's unofficial queen. When Victoria's eyes landed on Clint, her brow furrowed. She leaned toward her friend and whispered loudly, "Who let that guy in here? Doesn't he look like he belongs on a ranch, not at an event like this?" Her friend stifled a laugh, glancing over at Clint. "Isn't that Clint Eastwood?" she whispered back. Victoria scoffed, waving a manicured hand dismissively. "Oh, please, he's ancient. What's he even doing here? Trying to relive the glory days? Poor thing probably couldn't even afford one of the items on the auction list." Their laughter carried across the room, loud enough for several people, including Clint, to hear. He didn't react, keeping his focus on the stage where the auctioneer was introducing the first item of the night. But the murmurs around him indicated that others had noticed the exchange. The auction was underway, and the crowd grew livelier with each item introduced. Exotic vacations, rare artworks, and luxury cars were paraded across the stage, with bids climbing into the tens of thousands. The room buzzed with excitement, the rich flexing their wealth while pretending to care about the cause. Clint remained quiet, occasionally glancing at the auction catalog. Unlike the others, he wasn't there to show off. His focus was on an upcoming item, a piece of land adjacent to a nature reserve he had been supporting for years. Owning it would ensure the area stayed protected, but he knew the bidding would be fierce. Victoria Hensley, meanwhile, had no intention of letting Clint go unnoticed. Seated near the front, she made a point of speaking loudly whenever he was within earshot. "Honestly, I don't even know why they let just anyone in these days," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Aren't events like this supposed to be exclusive?" Her friends chuckled, egging her on. "Well, maybe he's here to bid on a steak dinner," one joked, prompting another round of laughter. Clint turned a page in the catalog, unfazed, but others in the room began exchanging awkward glances, clearly uncomfortable with Victoria's behavior. One man leaned toward her, whispering, "Victoria, I think that really is Clint Eastwood. You know, the Hollywood legend?" She rolled her eyes dramatically. "Hollywood legend?" she said loudly. "More like Hollywood history. What has he even done in the last 20 years? Sit around polishing his Oscars?" Laughter rippled through her group, but this time it wasn't as enthusiastic. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, stealing glances at Clint to see if he would respond, but Clint stayed composed, his face unreadable. The auctioneer tapped his microphone, redirecting the room's attention to the next item, a rare vintage watch that immediately sparked a flurry of bidding. Clint sat back, waiting patiently for the item he cared about, while Victoria smirked smugly, convinced she'd put him in his place. But she had no idea what Clint Eastwood was about to do. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the room, introducing the next item. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have a truly unique opportunity. A 50-acre plot of land bordering the pristine wildlife reserve in the Sierra Nevada. A rare chance to own a piece of untouched nature while supporting our conservation efforts. Bidding starts at $50,000. The crowd murmured with interest. The description alone was enticing, but for Clint, this was more than a luxury purchase. It was personal. He leaned forward slightly, his focus sharpening as the bidding began. 50,000, someone called out. 60, came another voice. The bids climbed quickly, jumping in increments of $10,000. Clint raised his paddle for the first time, his deep voice carrying across the room. 100,000. The room quieted slightly as people turned to look at him. It was the first bid he'd made all night, and for many, it was the first time they'd noticed him at all. Victoria, seated near the front, narrowed her eyes, finally realizing he was serious. 150,000, another bidder called. Clint didn't hesitate. 200,000, he said firmly, raising his paddle again. The auctioneer grinned. 200,000! Do I hear 250? Victoria smirked, leaning toward her friends. Oh, this is going to be good, she said. Watch him try to keep up. 250,000, she called out, raising her paddle high. Heads turned as she gave Clint a pointed look, her lips curling into a smug smile. Clint met her gaze, his expression calm and composed. He raised his paddle again. 300,000! The room buzzed with excitement as the bid soared higher. Victoria's smile faltered slightly, but she raised her paddle again. 350. Clint didn't flinch. 400,000. The tension in the room was palpable now. All eyes were on Clint and Victoria as they went back and forth, their bids climbing higher with each round. Victoria's confidence began to waver, her smile becoming strained. It was clear she hadn't expected Clint to put up much of a fight. By the time the bid reached $500,000, she hesitated, glancing nervously at her friends. Do it, one of them whispered. Show him who's boss. Victoria raised her paddle again. 550. Clint leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. The room waited in silence as he considered his next move. 600,000, Clint said finally, his voice steady. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Even the auctioneer seemed momentarily stunned before recovering. 600,000? Do I hear 650? Victoria froze, her hand gripping her paddle tightly. She glanced around trying to gauge the reaction of the crowd. Her friends gave her uncertain looks, and it was clear she was reaching her limit. Finally, she set her paddle down, forcing a smile. Let him have it, she said, her tone dismissive. It's not worth that much anyway. The auctioneer slammed his gavel. Sold! To the gentleman in the back for $600,000. Applause erupted, but Victoria's expression darkened. Clint gave a small nod, his calm demeanor unchanged, as he signed the paperwork to finalize the purchase. The room buzzed with excitement, but Victoria wasn't done with him yet. As the applause died down and the next item was introduced, Victoria couldn't hide her irritation. Her flawless composure cracked as she glared at Clint from across the room. Her friends whispered nervously, trying to dissuade her, but she waved them off. She wasn't about to let Clint Eastwood steal the spotlight. She stood gracefully, smoothing her designer gown, and made her way toward the back of the room where Clint sat. The crowd noticed immediately, their conversations quieting as they watched her approach him. Clint, still seated, sipped a glass of water, seemingly unaware of her presence until she stopped directly in front of him. Well, she said loudly, ensuring everyone could hear, it looks like someone came ready to spend their retirement savings. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. A few people exchanged glances, clearly unsure of where this was going. Clint looked up at her, his expression calm but sharp. Something I can help you with? He asked, his voice low and steady. Victoria gave him a tight smile, her tone dripping with condescension. Oh, I just wanted to congratulate you on your big win. It's not every day someone like you can compete with the real players in the room. The subtle jab wasn't lost on anyone. A few guests gasped softly, while others looked away, pretending not to listen. Clint leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment before responding. I appreciate the congratulations, he said simply. But you're wrong about one thing. Victoria raised an eyebrow, feigning curiosity. Oh? And what's that? Clint's eyes narrowed slightly. This isn't a competition, he said. It's a charity auction. The goal isn't to win, it's to make a difference. You might want to think about that. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, and Victoria's face flushed with anger. Well, she said, struggling to maintain her composure, some of us do make a difference, by bringing elegance and class to events like these. Not everyone can say the same. Clint gave a small chuckle, shaking his head. Elegance and class, huh? He said. Funny how you can have so much of it and still miss the point. The crowd erupted into quiet laughter and applause, and Victoria's face turned beet red. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Clint stood, towering over her slightly, and gave her a nod. "If you'll excuse me," he said calmly, "I've got some land to protect." With that, he walked past her, leaving the room buzzing with whispered conversations. Victoria stood frozen, her flawless image cracking under the weight of the moment. As Clint made his way toward the auction organizers, the crowd parted to let him through. Conversations buzzed around him, people murmuring about the bold exchange they had just witnessed. Some whispered admiration for Clint's composure, while others shook their heads at Victoria's behavior. Clint approached a woman standing near the stage, the event's host and the head of the Wildlife Foundation. She greeted him warmly, clearly impressed. "Mr. Eastwood, I can't thank you enough for your generous bid," she said. "This land will make such a difference to our preservation efforts." Clint gave her a small nod. "That's what it's about," he said simply. "Making sure the next generation has something worth saving." The woman smiled, but her expression turned serious. "I have to ask, why did you go so far? Most people would have stopped long before the bid reached 600,000. Clint's eyes flickered with determination. "I've been working with this reserve for years," he said. "I know what it means to the wildlife and the people who depend on it. I wasn't about to let it fall into the wrong hands." The host's eyes widened slightly and she leaned in. "You mean Victoria?" Clint gave a subtle nod, his expression unreadable. She wasn't bidding to support the cause. She was bidding to win, because she couldn't stand the idea of someone like me outbidding her. The host shook her head, her admiration for Clint growing. "Well, you've done something incredible tonight. That land is in good hands thanks to you." Clint's voice softened. "Just make sure it stays that way." Nearby, a few attendees approached cautiously, eager to express their gratitude. "Mr. Eastwood," one man said, extending a hand, "that was one of the classiest things I've ever seen. You didn't just buy land, you sent a message." Clint shook the man's hand, his expression calm. "Messages are only worth something if they lead to action," he said. "Let's make sure this event isn't just for show." The man nodded, clearly inspired, and stepped back. Clint glanced around the room, noticing the subtle shift in energy. People were no longer focused on flaunting their wealth. They were talking about the cause, the purpose of the night. And that, to Clint, was worth more than any applause. Across the room, Victoria sat stiffly in her chair, surrounded by her entourage. Her friends murmured half-hearted reassurances, but it was clear they were just as embarrassed as she was. She clutched her champagne glass tightly, her knuckles white, as she watched Clint speak with the auction organizers. "I don't get it," she muttered under her breath. "Why is everyone acting like he's some kind of hero? He's just lucky." One of her friends hesitated before responding, her voice low. "It's not about luck, Victoria. He cares about the cause. That's why people are on his side." Victoria shot her a sharp look, but her friend quickly looked away. The murmurs around the room grew louder as more people approached Clint to thank him. Even those who had been indifferent at the start of the night were now inspired by his quiet but powerful display of integrity. Unable to take it any longer, Victoria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. The sound drew attention, and the crowd turned to look at her. For a moment, she froze, realizing all eyes were on her again. But instead of backing down, she raised her chin and walked toward Clint, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "Mr. Eastwood," she said loudly, her voice cutting through the chatter. The room went silent as everyone turned to watch the confrontation. Clint turned slowly, his calm gaze meeting hers. "Yes?" he said simply. Victoria forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Congratulations on your big win," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "I'm sure you'll enjoy bragging about it to all your cowboy friends." Clint tilted his head slightly, his expression neutral. "It's not about bragging," he said. "It's about doing the right thing." Victoria let out a sharp laugh. "The right thing? Please. Let's not pretend this wasn't about making yourself look good." Clint studied her for a moment, then took a step closer, his voice low but firm. "If I cared about looking good," he said, "I wouldn't waste my time arguing with people like you." The crowd gasped softly and Victoria's face turned bright red. Clint didn't wait for her response. He stepped past her, addressing the room instead. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice steady. "It's about the land, the wildlife, and the people who rely on these resources. If you're here tonight and all you care about is winning, You're missing the point." The room erupted into applause, and Victoria stood frozen, humiliated and speechless. Clint nodded to the crowd, his composure unshaken, and returned to his seat. As the applause grew louder, Clint returned to his seat, his demeanor as calm as ever. The room buzzed with energy, but this time, it wasn't about wealth or status. It was about the cause. People were inspired, many whispering about how they could contribute more meaningfully to the charity. Victoria, on the other hand, stood frozen in place. Her confidence, her air of superiority, had completely crumbled. She glanced around the room, but the admiration and attention she once commanded had shifted entirely to Clint. For the first time that night, she looked small and out of place. The auctioneer stepped back to the microphone, his voice brimming with excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "what an incredible night it has been. Thanks to the generosity of everyone here, and especially to Mr. Clint Eastwood, we've raised enough money to fund several new conservation projects." The room erupted into cheers and applause, and Clint gave a small nod of acknowledgement. But as the crowd began to settle, the auctioneer wasn't done. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, "would you like to say a few words?" Clint stood slowly, the room falling into an expectant hush. He glanced around at the crowd, his sharp eyes taking in every face. Finally he spoke, his voice steady and deliberate. "I appreciate the recognition," he began, "but this isn't about me. It's about the work this foundation does, and the work we all need to do to protect the things that matter. The land I bid on tonight isn't just dirt and trees. It's a home for wildlife, a resource for communities, and a piece of something bigger than ourselves." The crowd listened intently, hanging on his every word. Even Victoria, still standing off to the side, couldn't look away. Clint continued, his tone softening. "If tonight taught me anything, it's that we all have a choice. We can choose to make a difference, or we can choose to let our egos get in the way. But I'll tell you this, when you focus on what truly matters, the rewards are greater than anything money can buy." The room erupted into a standing ovation, the applause echoing through the grand ballroom. Clint nodded humbly before taking his seat, his message resonating with everyone in the room. As the night wound down, guests approached Clint one by one to thank him, not just for his contribution, but for reminding them of the true purpose of the event. Even Victoria, though reluctant, approached him before leaving. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "you were right." Clint gave her a small smile. "It's not about being right," he said. "It's about doing what's right." With that, Victoria nodded and walked away, leaving Clint surrounded by people eager to shake his hand and share their own stories of inspiration. The auction wasn't just a success. It was a turning point for everyone involved, a reminder that true class and integrity come from the actions we take, not the wealth we display. As Clint walked out of the ballroom that night, the applause still echoing in his ears, he tipped his hat slightly to the doorman and disappeared into the cool night air. He hadn't just made a difference, he'd left a legacy,